So just a word about tonight's speaker, Adam Hochschild. Adam Hochschild is the author of a number of books, including Half the Way Home, The Mirror at Midnight, and my personal favorite, Bury the Chains, Prophets and Rebels in the Fight to Free an Empire's Slaves. 3 of his books, including King Leopold's Ghost, have been named Notable Books of the Year by the New York Times Book Review and Library Journal. Professor Hochschild has also written for The New Yorker, Harper's, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times Magazine, Mother Jones, and The Nation. He teaches writing in the Graduate School of Journalism at the University of California at Berkeley, and is joining us from San Francisco. We are particularly delighted to have him with us tonight to speak on his most recent book, Rebel Cinderella, which takes place largely over a century ago, but also feels relevant on so many levels. The New York Times says, Adam Hochschild writes movingly about an unlikely pair who also served as a potent symbol. Hochschild is a superb writer who makes light work of heavy subjects. Where information is scant or non-existent, he deploys elegant workarounds that evoke a vivid sense of time and place. Hochschild's book shows us what a radical movement looked like from the inside, with all of its high-flown idealism and personal intrigues. Whatever protections we take for granted once seemed unfathomable before they became real. Thank you for joining us. Enjoy the presentation.
Hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you. And clicking on the list of people here, it's a pleasure to see several of you whom I know, including a couple whom I haven't seen for far too many years. So thanks for joining tonight. And I'm really glad to have a chance to talk with you about my latest book. I am going to share my screen now, and you should be seeing the cover of the book on the screen. The book is mostly about this woman, Rose Pastor Stokes, a remarkable but today almost entirely forgotten figure. But it's also about her very unusual marriage, and one which I hope is a window onto life in this country a little more than a century ago, its hopes, its illusions, and its enormous injustices. So let me trace her story first. The woman who became Rose Pastor Stokes was born in Tsarist Russia in the town of Augustov in 1879. She was Jewish, but the Jews of Augustov, or at least some of them, did not live in a separate shtetl, because Rose's father, from whom her mother separated very soon after she was born, he was a cobbler, and he lived above his shop on this central square of the town. When Rose was born, the Russian Empire was then under the rule of Tsar Alexander II. He was the reformer Tsar, the Tsar who freed the serfs. And he also eased a few of the severe restrictions on Russia's Jews. He was by no means a human rights activist, but let's just say he was considerably less anti-Semitic than others in the Romanov dynasty. However, the lives of Rose and her family and millions of others were upended by an event that took place 2 years after her birth, hundreds of miles away in St. Petersburg, the empire's capital. Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. And as soon as he was dead, his successor imposed very harsh new restrictions on Russian Jews. And then there were a series of pogroms over the next 25 years. Hundreds of people were killed, often Jewish homes and shops were burned, leaving their owners homeless. And this was what spurred the great exodus of millions of Jews from the Russian Empire. And among them was Rose, then 3 years old, and her divorced mother. They stayed first for 7 years in London, living in considerable poverty in the city's East End. And it was there that Rose had the only formal schooling she ever had, less than 2 years. But it was enough for her to gain the ability to read and write in English and to discover a great love for English poetry. When Rose was 11 years old in 1890, she and her mother came to the United States I wish I could say this is a picture of her. It's not, but they traveled on a packed immigrant ship like this one and went to Cleveland, Ohio. And there, Rose immediately had to go to work in a factory making cigars at the age of 11. No time to go to school. This is the first known picture of her, taken in 1896. She's third from the left in the back row. Here it is a little closer. 16 years old in the center of the back row here. She did this work manufacturing cigars for a dozen years. And by the end of that time, she was supporting herself, her mother, and 6 younger siblings who had been abandoned by a ne'er-do-well stepfather. She worked during the days, sometimes evenings as well, earned $8 a week, equivalent to about $240 today. Not much on which to support a family of that size. And rolling cigars was hard work. The oil and the tobacco soaked into your clothes, your skin. It was impossible to get rid of the smell. And the air in these tobacco factories was kept humid because the windows were nailed shut in summer in order to keep the leaves that wrapped the cigars from drying out. And very fine tobacco dust filled the air, and it filled workers' lungs. Cigar workers had the second highest rate of tuberculosis in the United States. Only stonecutters had it worse. And Rose would have lung problems as long as she lived. When she was 21 years old, still working as in a cigar factory, something had happened that changed her life. A neighbor showed her a copy of a Yiddish newspaper published in New York, the Yiddish's Tageblatt, or Jewish Daily News. The paper ran one page in English, and it invited contributions from readers around the country. It was a New York daily that was trying to go national. And Rose began sending in articles, short stories, sentimental poetry, and very soon the paper gave her a column, an advice column called Just Between Ourselves Girls, which she wrote under the pen name of Zelda. And she was amazed one day to get a check in the mail for $2 and realize that she could actually get paid for writing. She was even more amazed when, after doing this for 2 years, the newspaper invited her to come to New York and to be based in New York at the newspaper's headquarters, writing for its English language page at double the salary that she'd made as a cigar worker. So she arrived in New York City in 1903, 23 years old. And imagine how extraordinary the city looked then to somebody who was seeing it for the first time. Skyscrapers like none she'd ever seen before, elevated trains like this one puffing along above the street, trolleys below pulled by cables underneath the street, an enormous subway network being built but not yet open, and even on the streets a few of the new horseless carriages. New York was a city then that would have terrified Donald Trump because it was a city of immigrants. More than half the men over 21 in Manhattan were foreign born. New York would soon be the largest city in the world. It was already, at this point in 1903, the largest Jewish city in the world. And this is the Lower East Side, where Rose lived and worked. She wrote about people like these peddlers, people who worked in the shops, like the one you can see behind the peddlers. These were the people about whom she did feature stories and interviews and so forth for the newspaper. But one day in the summer of 1903, after she'd been working at the paper in the city for about 6 months, the editor gave her a different kind of assignment, which was to go and interview someone who worked on the Lower East Side in a settlement house. And I'm sure you know something about settlement houses. They were set up to provide services to poor neighborhoods, things like childhood nutrition programs, baths and showers, not just for kids, but for adults, because these were the kinds of things that, tens of thousands of tenements in New York didn't have. Settlement houses held adult education classes in English literacy and other subjects. Now, settlement houses served a population that was almost entirely immigrant and poor, but the volunteers who staffed them tended to be well-to-do college graduates. This is the settlement house on the Lower East Side, the University Settlement, still there today, incidentally, where Rose was sent. And here's the man she was sent to interview, a volunteer worker there who actually lived in the settlement house, which was customary for many of these volunteers. James Graham Phelps Stokes, Graham to his friends. And as you can tell from the name, he was Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And he and Rose fell in love. Now, Graham Stokes came from the most different kind of background imaginable. Here, for example, is his family's summer home in the Berkshires, Western Massachusetts. When it was built, it was the largest private home in the United States, 100 rooms. Legend has it that one of Graham's brothers, who was in the class of 1896 at Yale, sent a telegram to his mother saying, bringing some apostrophe 96 fellows home for the weekend. The apostrophe got dropped from the telegram, and his mother replied by telegram, many guests already here, have only room for 50. Now, if you were writing a novel, somebody who lives in a house like this falls in love with a poor immigrant sweatshop worker living on the Lower East Side. Nobody would believe it, but it happened. When not at one of several country places they had, Graham's family lived in New York in this mansion at Madison Avenue and 37th Street. Today, it's part of the Morgan Library. Here are Graham Stokes' parents. Each came from quite large fortunes, which they combined. Some of the money came from the Phelps Dodge mining empire, some from New York real estate, especially apartment buildings on the Upper East Side, and some from a cluster of gold and silver mines in Nevada and a railroad that led to them. Graham's parents had 9 children, and they and some of their spouses and offspring are in this photograph. The boys in the family were expected to play prominent roles, and they did. One became a quite famous architect. One became an editorial writer for the New York Times. One became what today would be called provost at Yale University. A grandson became an Episcopal bishop. The girls in the family were expected to marry well, and they did. One married a nobleman and became a baroness. Another married into the family of a former Secretary of State. But Graham took a somewhat different route in life than his brothers and sisters. After graduating from Yale, he went to medical school at Columbia, and while working on a horse-drawn ambulance out of Roosevelt Hospital, he was exposed to a very different New York than the one he'd grown up in. This was before he met Rose. He was shocked by what he saw. This was the New York of the tenements, where often immigrants were living packed 6, 7, 8 people to a room. And often the tenements, the only toilets they had were outdoor outhouses like these. And of course, New York's tenements were notorious for being not just living spaces, but also factories, makeshift sweatshops for garment workers. Graham Stokes was outraged by what he saw, and that was what led him to become part of the settlement house movement. He and Rose courted secretly for 2 years, and finally news of their engagement leaked out. And it received immense attention. Newspapers across the United States, in Europe and Australia, everywhere reported the news. This, incidentally, is the page one headline from the New York Times about their engagement. Here it is as the lead story on the front page of the New York Evening World. And as you can see, what attracted people's attention was not just that it was a marriage between someone extremely rich and someone extremely poor, but between Jew and Gentile, which was very unusual for that time. So there was both a class and an ethnic difference. It's exactly what makes people fascinated with such marriages today, like, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, and probably other people we can think of as well. This newspaper, The World, immediately signed Rose up to write a series of articles, calling her the genius of the ghetto. Finally, despite the well-concealed dismay of Graham's family, they married on July 18th, 1905, Rose's 26th birthday. Graham was 7 years older. The press remained fascinated by this couple, and they lived in a blaze of publicity for years. The core of the public's fascination was that here there seemed to be the Cinderella story. Prince Charming had rescued poor, virtuous Cinderella from her humble hearth and brought her to live in his castle. And of course, love was going to conquer all the differences between them. Here's Rose within a year or two after they married. However, their lives didn't quite fit the Cinderella script, for Graham to some degree had left the castle and Rose had no desire to live in one. Although they often stayed at one of the houses of his parents, it always made her uncomfortable. She and Graham were both acutely conscious that they lived in a country with enormous disparities of wealth. Some people lived the way Graham's family did, others were desperately poor, and often worked in dangerous conditions as well, like these child coal miners in West Virginia. In 1906, the year after they married, Rose and Graham joined the group that they thought had the best answer to all of these problems, the Socialist Party. Its leader at the time was Eugene V. Debs, a noble, much beloved man, 5 times a candidate for president. He had begun as leader of the Railway Workers Union, and when he campaigned for president in 1908, this was after the couple had joined the party, he barnstormed across the country in a special train called the Red Special, with red flags and red bunting flying. And engineers of passing locomotives were thrilled when they saw the Red Special coming along and greeted him with long whistle blasts. That same year, 1908, Graham was on the platform with Debs when the Red Special came to New York, because Graham was running as social candidate for the New York State Legislature from the Lower East Side. Rose campaigned for him. Neither Graham nor Debs won, but people still remained fascinated by this couple, and everyone still saw it as the Cinderella story. Their marriage inspired 2 novels. Here's one of them. And this novel was actually turned into a silent film. Unfortunately, the film has been lost, like all too many silent films from that era. But we still have promotional photos from it of the actors playing the roles inspired by Rose and Graham. Your guess is as good as mine what they're saying to each other in this particular scene. Now, despite these Cinderella fantasies, this was a time when millions of Americans, even those not living in great poverty, were becoming aware of injustices. And one episode that dramatized the terrible labor conditions of the day involved clothing workers in New York City at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company just off Washington Square. A terrible fire, workers were trapped there. Most were unable to get out from the factory, which was on the upper floors of this building. There was an inadequate fire escape, which collapsed when a bunch of people got onto it. The door to a stairwell that would have provided a route of escape from the fire was locked to keep union organizers out. 146 people burned to death or leapt out the window to their deaths. Almost of the dead, almost all were women, half were teenagers, almost all were immigrants, Jewish and Italian. 120,000 people marched through Manhattan in a morning procession, and more than 300,000 people lined the streets. So this was the kind of thing that Rose was writing about as she continued her journalism. It was about issues of labor and social justice, and also women's rights. She got involved, for instance, in one case that had echoes of the kind of battles still going on in the Me Too era today. The case that drew her attention was that of a woman named Sarah Coton, who worked as a nurse on the Upper East Side for a doctor whose home and office were in the same building. I think it was on 96th Street, if I remember correctly. She lived in a room there where one night he piped chloroform under her door, and when she was unconscious, he raped her. A couple of weeks later, she realized she was pregnant, and she got a gun and shot and killed the doctor. Rose went to the prison where she was being held, interviewed her in Yiddish, told her story in the newspapers at much greater length than anyone else, and she announced that she would pay Sarah Coton's legal expenses, and once she was released from prison, would give her and the baby a place to stay. The trial, the murder trial, was delayed until Sarah Coton gave birth, but then she was found innocent, in part because another woman assaulted by the same doctor came forward. Starting a few years after Rose and Graham married, for a decade or more, the United States was convulsed by strikes like this one, with hundreds of thousands of workers walking out every year. And this was at a time when labor unions had almost none of the rights that they later acquired. Strikes were often suppressed by police. These are police in Chicago arresting a striking worker there. Sometimes by troops. These are striking clothing workers in Massachusetts facing a state militia. One big strike of garment workers was in New York City. And if you look at the signs in this picture, you can see that they are in 4 languages, English, Yiddish, Italian, and Russian. Rose was heavily involved, speaking to groups of strikers, often many times each day, sometimes in English and sometimes in Yiddish. And it was really in this strike in 1909 that she came into her own as an organizer and as an immensely popular speaker. She was soon recognized as one of the great radical orators of her time. And she soon eclipsed her husband, and gradually the ongoing cascade of newspaper stories were much more about her than about the two of them as a couple. And there are signs that he was not happy about this. One thing that caused some strain in the relationship was perhaps the most colorful strike that Rose got involved in, which was of hotel and restaurant workers in New York in 1912. Organizers walked into one restaurant or hotel dining room after another by prearrangement, usually just as lunch or dinner was about to be served, blew a whistle, and the waiters walked out. They did this at the Waldorf Astoria, Delmonico's, the Luncheon Club of the New York Stock Exchange, and many, many other restaurants. Rose was on the strike committee. She addressed many rallies of these striking waiters. She wrote and spoke about the miserable conditions in which many of them worked. And in her papers, there are many, many letters of thanks from waiters and hotel workers. Now, one of the hotels struck was the Ansonia. That building may look familiar because it's still there today, reborn as an apartment house on Broadway between 73rd and 74th Street. The Ansonia was claimed as the largest hotel in the world at the time. Possibly it was. It had several dining rooms, and it was a famous gathering place for musicians, show business people, and mobsters. And when the strike began there, this caused problems in the Stokes family because the owner of the hotel was Graham's uncle, William Earl Dodge Stokes, or Uncle Will, as they called him. He was a passionate hater of labor unions, immigrants, and much else. He was very much involved in the eugenics movement. He was absolutely furious that his beloved nephew's wife was organizing his own workers to go on strike against him. And he comes back into the story a little bit later. You'll see. Let me turn to another aspect of Rose and Graham's lives, which made them so fascinating for me to write about. It was the people they knew. They knew and worked with what to me are some of the most interesting people in the United States of that era. Here are some of them. Here's Rose on the right with Eugene Debs on the left, and Max Eastman, the editor of The Masses, in its era, I think the best magazine in the country, in many, many ways sort of a precursor of the New Yorker. Also in their circle was Big Bill Haywood, the leader of the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, the country's most militant labor union, a former miner, cowboy, saloon card dealer, charismatic orator, famous for using his fists when he had to, and for being able to recite long passages of Shakespeare by heart. They also knew and worked with John Reed, who was probably the finest journalist of his generation, with Lincoln Steffens, the great muckraker, W.E.B. Du Bois, the greatest black intellectual of his time, Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones, the labor organizer. They knew all of these people. Upton Sinclair, to whose novel The Jungle we owe our food and drug laws. As he was writing it, he sent it chapter by chapter to Graham Stokes to get his comments. They knew Margaret Sanger, the birth control pioneer, in the middle in this picture. We take access to birth control for granted today, but this Brooklyn clinic where Sanger appears was shut down by the police, and Sanger was sent to jail. Rose was active in the campaign for birth control when talking publicly about such things was against the law. Another friend of theirs who was often in jail, this is one of her many mugshots, was Emma Goldman, the anarchist firebrand. All of these folks, Rose and Graham knew, they worked with, many were their house guests on occasion, and some left us their recollections of Rose and Graham. Emma Goldman, for instance, who was always very blunt, thought Graham Stokes was a stuffed shirt and couldn't understand how Rose put up with him. So the period of American life when all of these people were active was a remarkable time, a time when all of them believed that the world could be changed and that a new and more just society could be brought into being. Sadly, though, something happened that brought that period of great confidence and optimism to an end: the First World War. And it not only killed millions of soldiers and civilians, it also shattered the radicals' dream that the working classes of different countries would never fight each other. The United States, however, did not join the war when it started. American socialists and other radicals and many liberals agitated strongly for the U.S. to stay out of the war. Rose, Emma Goldman, and a lot of their friends joined something called the Women's Peace Party. This is a demonstration they were having on Fifth Avenue. But finally, in the spring of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before Congress and asked it to declare war. And American troops began going to France, soon in huge numbers. And by mid-1918, they were heavily involved in the most fierce fighting. Here at home, the country was swept by war fever and by ferocious government propaganda, like this U.S. Army enlistment poster. There was a tremendous paranoia about spies, asking people to look for spies and traitors on all sides. A lot of that paranoia was directed against anyone who opposed the war. I don't know if you can read the caption at the top of this cartoon, but it says, "Now for a roundup," Uncle Sam rounding up all of these traitors who are against the war. And many people, however, still felt that the war was a huge mistake, but they were harassed or arrested when they spoke out about this. The war created a rift between Rose and Graham. She became firmly convinced that it was a terrible mistake for the United States to join the war. Graham was so enthusiastic that he enlisted and went into uniform. He was too old to be sent overseas, despite many attempts, never got closer to combat than marching down Fifth Avenue with his National Guard unit, but he stayed in uniform for several years. Something else that divided Rose and Graham happened in late 1917, the same year as the U.S. entered the war, the Russian Revolution, the second stage when the Bolsheviks seized power. Rose was for this, Graham was against it. Rose continued speaking out against the war and now in favor of the Russian Revolution. And this drew the rage of many people, including Graham's uncle, the angry hotel owner. You'll remember him. Here's a report about him from the Bureau of Investigation, predecessor of the FBI, where, as you can see, they say the agent received words from W.E.B. Stokes that Rose Pastor Stokes might have a subversive literature at her residence. And we know from government records that a few days later, he called the Bureau of Investigation, told them that Rose and Graham would be out of town and that it was a good chance for them to search the house, which they did. The Bureau kept a very close eye on Rose. Agents followed her when she spoke. Stenographers transcribed her speeches. And after one anti-war talk, she was arrested. Charged under the Espionage Act, which was the sort of catch-all act under which they prosecuted people who opposed the war. She was found guilty, sentenced to 10 years in prison. Graham put up bail money, they appealed the case, and several years later, the sentence was eventually overturned on appeal, so she didn't have to go to jail. But by this point, the marriage was on the rocks. They remained together for 7 more years, but very uneasily because they were going very different directions in politics. Rose joined the Communist Party, and she actually went to Russia in 1922 as an American delegate to a meeting of the Communist International. Like far too many people at that time, she thought that in Russia she had found paradise. Graham looked for paradise in a different direction, abandoned all his involvement in progressive politics, and became deeply interested in religion, particularly in blending the traditions of Hinduism and Christianity. Finally, in 1925, they got divorced very bitterly, and this put them back on the front pages for the last time. As soon as they were no longer a couple, the press completely lost interest in them, and they dropped out of the news. But happily for me, they saved all their letters. Rose kept a diary. They wrote dueling memoirs. So there was rich material to work from in reconstructing their stories, their relationship, and the ringside seat they had to a remarkable period of American history. So please do historians a favor. Save your letters. These days, save your emails, your texts. Write memoirs. It gives us something to work from. After the divorce, Graham remarried, but did not make a leap out of his class this time. He married the daughter of a railroad executive, and he lived on to the age of 88, dying in 1960. Rose, when they got divorced, as a matter of principle, refused alimony. She was reduced to poverty again. She remarried, but to someone as poor as she. She soon came down with cancer, and she died at the age of 53 in 1933. So that's their story. I wish I could say they changed the world. They didn't, but perhaps through their eyes we can see a world that needed changing and that still does today. And I hope you'll enjoy getting to know them as much as I did. So I think I'm going to stop right here and see if anyone has questions that you want to ask. And
I just want to note that I did just pop in the chat the link to Rose's memoir in the library's collection. We have the first edition, I assume it is anyway. We have an early edition in the open stacks there. So if anybody wants to come and take a look at that. We do not seem to have Graham's memoir, however, unless I'm just not seeing his name. So there you go. Whoever was acquiring books for the library at the time chose a side.
Actually, Graham's memoir is unpublished. It's never been published. So the library's doing its job.
Audience members, do please pop your questions in the chat, and I will just voice them aloud if that works. But I'm going to start with a couple of my own questions, if that sounds good. So I'm really interested by the way the media portray first their marriage and then subsequently her supposed downfall. It seemed to me that the headlines that we saw in the presentation about their marriage show him kind of stooping to bring her, to uplift her, but not her reaching or being I can't think of the phrase I want, being after the money or anything like that, as though she were interpreted, say, as the deserving poor as opposed to the undeserving poor. Or maybe that's not an applicable thing. But then the language when she's on trial, it makes me wonder, and then they say, she was too radical for him. Does it seem like sort of a punishment for her having gotten above her station, or is that not really a relevant concept given the media portrayal?
It's complicated, the media portrayal thing. I think you're absolutely right, Sarah, that initially the media treated her as the deserving poor who had the great good luck to, be taken up by this benevolent patrician. But Rose was actually very skilled at dealing with the media. She had been a newspaper reporter herself. She knew exactly what kind of material reporters want. For example, at one point, a reporter interviewed her when she was on a speaking tour and met her over breakfast at a hotel in St. Louis. And, Rose knew journalists like to overhear dialogue. So when the waiter served them breakfast, she asked the waiter, was he in the union? Yes, he was. Well, what's the story? How are things? And of course, all this made it into the reporter's story. So she was very skilled at portraying herself the way she wanted to be portrayed in the newspaper. And indeed, if any reporter got a detail wrong, there was a letter to the editor the next day. And if it was a wire service story, letters to a number of different papers. So she was sort of portrayed as, I think they gave a pretty accurate portrayal of her the way that she wanted, as a forthright campaigner for socialism, and
I love the idea of her as media savvy. I mean, it's so modern or postmodern to think of somebody, but of course, it makes perfect sense. So hello, Tracy Kwan. You have a good question here in the chat. Where is Graham's unpublished memoir housed or archived, assuming you looked at it during your research? And also a comment, he took up yoga. How about that? Talk about modern or postmodern for somebody in the West.
He did. His memoir is actually, it was loaned to me by a member of the family very kindly, and it's not in any collection. It should be. He donated something like 120 boxes of his papers to Columbia, where I spent a lot of time looking at them on his death. But the memoir is not among us. And then I was not among them. So, question, how, I see there's a question coming here. Can you tell us how you researched your book? How often did you use the library? I love libraries, and that's why I'm so glad to be able to talk to you. If I were in New York, I'm sure I would be a member of the Society Library, as several of my friends and relatives are. Um, the book was based on really, so in addition to published material, for which most of which I got from the library of the University of California at Berkeley, which is one of the world's greatest and which I'm very lucky to be able to use. Uh, the basic collections of the book were Rose's letters and papers, which are mostly at NYU in the Tamiment Library um, on Washington Square, which has in fact, it's right across from where the Triangle Fire was. The Tenement Library has special collections on the American left and labor movement and so forth. And they got some of Rose's papers after she died, and then she had an admirer, someone who knew her when he was a teenager, who, in the years after her death, made it his business to collect more of her papers by writing to people that she might have written to and saying, "Do you have any letters from Rose Pastor Stokes?" and so forth. Then there was this other collection at Columbia, as I mentioned, of Graham's papers. And then there's another big batch of Stokes family papers at Yale. So I spent a couple of days there. So those three archives were where
That's great.
I did most of my
certainly
my
libraries and archives tremendously important for biographers and historians, I think we can safely say. But also I always love that if there's a keeper of the flame sort of figure, somebody who, as you say, asked people for their letters and so forth. That's great. Someone asks, I suspect, what did she, meaning Rose, see in him, meaning Graham?
Yeah. Hello, Bob and Laura. Lovely to see you on here. Great to know that you're listening. What did she see in him? It's a good question, because to me, he's ultimately a rather unappealing figure. I think Emma Goldman was right that he was something of a stuffed shirt, but I think he had some very commendable impulses early in his life. You know, he was so moved by the poverty he saw as a medical student in New York that he wanted to do something about it, and that this was what took him into the settlement house movement. But it was a peculiar thing, the settlement house movement, because it both attracted a lot of idealists who were college graduates, educated people who wanted to change the world, but they tended to stick to each other when they were in the movement. The university settlement, for example, where Graham worked and lived for several years, the volunteers lived on the top two floors of the settlement, socialized mostly with each other, had the most extraordinary array of people there as dinner guests over the years. Members of Parliament from England, Emma Goldman, writers like Upton Sinclair, Lincoln Steffens, and so forth. But the impression I get from reading their memoirs is that they were a bit full of themselves. And part of the excitement of being in the settlement house movement was that they got to socialize with people like themselves. Graham did not have the knack of being comfortable with people who were very unlike himself. Rose did. And the remarkable thing about her to me is that she could talk to any kind of audience. And if you look at her speeches, when she speaks to a labor audience, she's talking about, what it was like to work in the cigar factories and how she once unwittingly worked too hard and allowed the factory owner to use her pace as a speed up for the other workers. When she talked to a religious audience, she would do it in terms of stories from the Bible. She had a wonderful knack of being friends with a huge variety of people, and her letters reflect that. People from every walks of life. Graham did not have that breadth in him. But I think she she was young when she met him. She was 23 years old. I think she was awed that here was somebody who was interested in her and who knew such an extraordinary range of people, and that's what originally attracted her to him. You can begin seeing in her diary about 6, 7, 8 years after she was married that she was starting to be disillusioned. See, we have another question from Minor. Hello, Minor. It's great to see you, or to see your question on here. I can't see your face. There are different reactions to Soviet Russia. You're right. Emma Goldman, much to her credit, she also, like so many people in 1917-18, was convinced that Russia was paradise, that this was the solution, the revolution was going to spread all over the world. She went to Russia. She was exiled from the United States. She lived there nearly 2 years. She had the advantage of speaking Russian. She very rapidly got deeply disillusioned and wrote about that very, very forcefully, which caused a break with her old friend Rose. Rose, although she too went to Russia a couple of years after Emma, she went only as a short-time visitor to go to this Congress of the Communist International. Of course, the Soviets were always very skilled at welcoming delegates to international meetings and so forth, giving them guided tours that only showed them, happy children and hardworking factory workers and construction going on, and didn't show them the, Gulag network, which was in the process of being built up at that point, and all of the dark side of Soviet life. I too was sorry that Rose was taken in by all this, because really up to that point in her life, I found a great deal to admire in her. Her passionate commitment to social justice, her lack of desire to become part of this very rich and comfortable world of Grams that she could have very easily become a part of, her wide acquaintance with all the interesting intellectuals of the time. But I was deeply disappointed that she was kind of taken in by the Soviets, as were so many people at that time. I can't agree that Rose did not affect any significant changes. Many great definitive changes in social justice are preceded by efforts and smaller accomplishments. I think you're right about that. In fact, so many things that we take for granted today, Medicare, the hope for finally a really comprehensive national health care program, Social Security, and much more. These were ideas that were really first put on the table by progressives of various stripes and socialists at the beginning of the 20th century. Labor legislation that makes it safe for labor unions to organize and prevents people from being fired for trying to organize unions. These were also things that these folks pioneered. So I think they didn't change the world completely in the overall sense, but they did help the world make some steps in that direction.
Yes, thank you. What a wonderful presentation. And I certainly agree. So I'm going to chuck in one more question, if that's good, and if anyone else has anything. So just thinking about the word socialist and how it has evolved, or the rest of it must have evolved away from it, possibly during the 20th and early 21st centuries. We think so much about the Red Scare of the 50s, but less now, I think, of the one of the World War I era. Do you think there are things that were unique about that earlier one that we've kind of lost sight of? And do you think that, given that socialist is such a scare word now, have we just lost track of what it means? Are there socialists these days in the United States, or really not? The movement is kind of...
Watch out, because I can talk for a whole hour trying to answer that question, because I'm writing a book about the post-World War I Red Scare right now. I think that the interesting thing about the word socialism is that it's a little bit like the word Christianity, because it's a system of ideas and ideals which has never really been achieved on earth. I mean, you certainly can't say, if Christianity means turning the other cheek and loving your neighbor and blessed are the poor and all that. There's no country on earth that's really a Christian society, and there's really no country on earth that's ever been a socialist society. The word socialism, I think, meant all kinds of imagined things to the people who used it in those early decades of the 20th century. It certainly meant a vastly more equal distribution of wealth. Exactly how that was to be achieved, people disagreed about. Some people thought it would require a violent revolution. Others thought it could all be done legally. It meant justice for farmers, who were considered a very oppressed class at that point. Did it mean that there would be collective ownership of farmland, or did it mean that small farmers would be able to own their own land? Everybody had a different interpretation. So there was really not, it was more a feeling than a blueprint, but a feeling of a desire for greater social justice for everybody. Now, for some socialists, blacks were excluded from that picture of social justice. For some socialists, women were excluded from that picture. But for others, somebody like Debs, for example, who was a passionate supporter both of racial justice and women's rights, they were very much included. So it's a word that meant many different things to many different people. Then it quickly became profoundly pejorative in once the United States entered the First World War, because that entering the war was accompanied by this tremendous patriotic hysteria, at first directed against Germans and people of German ancestry in the United States. And my father, who grew up in a German-speaking Jewish household in New York at that time, told me how terrifying it was, and that even though they spoke German at home, they didn't dare speak it on the street. But then, of course, it was the Germans who, in hopes that he would take Russia out of the war, which he did, moved Lenin from Switzerland back to Russia, thereby enabling the second stage of the Russian Revolution. So that patriotic hysteria against the Germans then very rapidly became against the Russians, against Bolshevism at the same time. And there were, of course, deep tensions in the US between capital and labor, and between, WASP Americans and newer immigrants. And people were extremely conscious that, a large proportion of Jews were socialists or communists of one sort or another. A number of Italians were anarchists. So the racial and ethnic tensions got mixed up in the Red Scare as well. But it's a fascinating story. And of course, all those currents of both ethnic and political hostility are still with us in very different forms today.
A white slavery investigation in one of your images might be an IWW sign. Is this a sardonic comment? Can you say more about the way this term was being used in that image?
I don't know the story behind that particular image, but my guess is that it probably referred to white slavery, meaning, bad conditions for labor, and that the mistreatment of workers was equivalent to slavery. That was probably rhetorically the way in which it was.
Well, thank you so much. I think we'll wrap up there for this evening. Professor Hochschild, we so much appreciate you being with us. Audience members, thank you for joining us. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Well, it was a great pleasure for me. Take care, everybody, and good to see some friends on here.